Hey, what's up, guys? What secrets are hidden within the depths of Reddit? What hidden truths lie buried beneath the surface of the internet? On this channel, we uncover the most mysterious and unsettling stories Reddit has to offer. Prepare to be captivated, disturbed, and maybe even a little bit scared. Are you brave enough to hear the truth? Subscribe now and let's find out together. I once asked a famous ghost hunter what his scariest moment was. This is his story. Back when I was in college, the Student Campus Activity Council hired a famous ghost hunter to come speak at our school. I've always loved the paranormal, so I left my skeptical boyfriend behind in his dorm and hightailed it over to the auditorium. The ghost hunter was someone I'd never heard of, but he had an impressive background and seemed to have several things in the works at the time. This was in 2005. I think he actually might have a TV show now. He was a man of small stature with a little white professor's beard and a receding hairline, but the way he spoke about the afterlife was fascinating. You could tell he truly believed what he claimed to see, and either that, or he was a hell of a salesman. He had us hanging on every word. We watched some interesting video clips of his investigations. He had a nice collection of photos and scary stories to go with them. I remember one about a haunted doll that he said moved freely around the room of the person who had picked it up at a flea market, just not when anyone was around to witness it. Towards the end, he opened up the floor for questions. There were your typical dumbass college kid questions. Have you ever seen someone's head spin around like The Exorcist? Logically, stuff like that, and a few that were actually pretty interesting. I decided I wasn't going to let this opportunity to speak to someone so apparently revered in the field of the supernatural slip away, so I raised my hand. The ghost hunter spotted me, pointed, and smiled. "Yes, you, the girl in the white shirt?" "Yeah, hi," I said, and I know I sounded nervous because I felt so dumb for sounding so nervous. "I was just wondering, what's the scariest thing you can remember from your career as a ghost hunter?" I was halfway back in the auditorium, quite a distance from the stage, but I saw his face fall. I know I did. "Well," he said, forcing a tight little laugh. It was forced, I know it was. "There are so many scary moments to recall. They tend to pop up quite often when you're in my line of work." This got a little chuckle from the audience. I suddenly felt pretty stupid for asking the question at all. He proceeded to tell some story about tracking a poltergeist in an abandoned elementary school and his flashlight failing. I remember because it really wasn't very scary. At least it didn't seem that way for someone who hunts ghosts for a living. He moved on from the story and answered a few more questions. He didn't look my way again. When it was over and everyone started to leave, I decided not to get stuck in the crush of students leaving through the front door. Feeling somewhat dejected, like I had done something wrong, I slipped quietly out the theater exit and headed for my dorm. The ghost hunter was sitting outside on a bench near the bike racks, smoking a cigarette. I ducked my head and tried to get by without him noticing. "Hey, kid." He took another drag and crushed the cigarette out on the cement bench beside him. "Listen, I'm sorry," I remember blurting, feeling like such a stupid little girl. "I know my question was dumb. I wasn't trying to make fun of you or anything." He shook his head. He brushed the ashes off the bench. He patted the space beside him, inviting me to sit. I hesitated. This could definitely be a case of stranger danger, just like they taught in the Intro to University classes. Then sat down, keeping a healthy distance between us. He was old, I was young, I could probably outrun the guy. Or who knows, maybe I was just as stupid as I felt. "I didn't tell the truth," the ghost hunter said. His face looked much older close up, the wrinkles deeper. The confident salesman aura had faded from him, leaving behind a man in his 60s who had clearly seen a lot of things. That story I told, it wasn't the scariest moment of my career. "I know," I remember saying. He nodded as though he had known I knew. "This is the scariest moment of my career," he said, and this is what he told me. It was the 1970s. I was a much younger man. I hadn't reached success in the paranormal industry quite yet, and was left to pick up the scraps that the pros didn't want. Usually they were schizophrenics whose broken minds tricked them into believing there were phantoms after them, or children playing pranks on gullible and concerned members of the neighborhood. If anything, it was a simple cleansing of the home with sage, and off I went. When I first got the call, I was ecstatic. What the client was describing appeared to be a full-blown demonic haunting, complete with physical manifestations, possession, and multiple witnesses. It was the break I was searching for. It was the break I needed. The only detail that truly worried me was that their teenage son, the person they claimed to be suffering from possession, had become violent with members of his family. Up until recently, he'd only acted out of character, moody. However, a week prior, he had tried to rape his older female cousin. She was shaken but mostly unharmed. The family sent her to live elsewhere until it could all be figured out. Therefore, when I headed out to their home, I made sure to arrive fully prepared. I brought holy water, crucifixes, sage, and, just for good measure, a small loaded handgun. I knew it wouldn't come to that, but something about the mother's frantic tone over the phone told me it was just a good idea. I wish I could say the visit itself was exciting. Unfortunately, from the moment I pulled into the driveway of the beautiful remodeled Victorian, all activity seemed to stop. That is, if it was ever there to begin with. I spent 2 weeks investigating the home. I used equipment considered very technologically advanced for the era. I studied energy waves. I interviewed the son whose family claimed to be possessed, when in fact he just seemed to be depressed, perhaps psychologically disturbed. I recommended a therapist, a renowned child psychologist, who was famous for his work with violent young men. On my last day in the house, they took him into the city for treatment. His parents returned shortly before midnight, retiring wearily to their bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen to go over my findings. There was nothing to be said, and I knew it. Everything they described could be written off to the hysterics of a family who couldn't admit their son was in desperate need of medical attention. Everything, that is, except for the drains in the floor. Upon touring the home, I was impressed with how up-to-date it had been brought. It was clearly from the early 1900s and kept in immaculate condition. The woodwork and character of the house was carefully preserved as it was given necessary updates like modern plumbing and electricity. The basement was the only area that seemed stuck in time. The walls were a clammy stone that was prone to gathering moisture, leaving it unfit to store anything vulnerable to spiders or mold. The family had left it empty for this reason, and, while it certainly felt very spooky to spend any amount of time in the windowless room with the single hanging light and its vast cement floors, I never recorded anything of note in this area. However, there was one thing I couldn't understand. Given the approximate time the home had been built and its presence in a residential neighborhood, there was simply no accounting for the 4 large slotted drains set in the cold concrete floor. As I sat alone in the kitchen, poring over my meager findings, trying to find meaning in all these words, I heard something. It was only a little sound at first, and so I ignored it. But then it came again, louder this time. There was a steep spiral staircase that led to the second floor, winding up from the corner of the small kitchen, and it was where the noise seemed to be coming from. Assuming it was simply one of the homeowners restless after dropping their son off in an institution, I glanced up. It was coming down the stairs. I can't say walking because that wasn't the case. It was just... floating isn't even the right word. Just coming. Coming down the stairs, straight at me. It had no eyes, it had no face. And yet somehow I knew it was looking at me, right at me, into the very depths of my soul. Then it spoke. I'm not sure how it spoke. I don't think I actually heard anything, so perhaps it used some sort of telepathy. Either way, I can recall the words to this very day. You know what he did to us. I didn't think so. I couldn't. I just ran. I upended my chair when I fled, scattering papers across the kitchen that claimed this house wasn't really haunted. It was all the hallucinations of a very sick boy. I left them there. Do you know how awful that is? I left those people in that house with that thing. I didn't stop driving for 30 miles, for God's sake. When I realized how far I'd gone, I finally pulled over and called the family from a payphone. They were the furthest thing from my mind when I saw it. All I could do was respond to the deep animal instinct to escape, to run out of that supposedly safe house with my tail between my legs. They moved, I think. I was unable to continue my investigation. In writing, I cited insufficient evidence, but I knew it was cowardice. I believe the house was leveled a few years later. I ended up doing my own research. Curiosity ate away at me with vicious little rat teeth as time went by, the accusation still ringing fresh in my ears. You know what he did to us. And eventually, yes, I did. Old newspaper clippings didn't tie the stories together, not necessarily, but I was able to piece some meaning out of the yellowed excerpts. At some point around the turn of the century, the house had been the residence to a well-respected mortician. Unable to find a building in town to suit his needs, he said, he built his own home office space. It was a grand feat of architecture and a shining example of a true entrepreneur, a man pursuing the American dream of running his own business. Upstairs, the bedroom. Mid-level, the funeral home. In the basement, a mortuary. I knew what the drains were for. Separately, decades later, another well-respected member of the local community was arrested under the suspicion of abuse of his professional position with moral cause. The newspaper didn't elaborate, probably due to the sensitive nature of the crimes, but his punishment was minor. After a brief stay in the local jail, the perpetrator stripped his home of all its value and left town before trial, never to be seen again. It didn't take much to guess the connection. I suppose I don't know for sure, but the words of that thing still echo through my head to this day. You know what he did to us. There was a reason that a mortician felt such a strong desire to build a house that contained his business, to suit his needs. The things that were done to those bodies in the basement were unspeakable. But yes, I know. I know what he did to them. And it's because of this, coming face to face with the true nature of man in its darkest places, that the encounter with that faceless thing is the scariest moment of my career. Because now I know. I still remember his expression, the way all the color dropped out of him as he went on, the white hair of his beard barely distinguishable from his pale skin, the slump of his shoulders, the way his voice shook. I apologized. He waved me off. He left. I felt terrible. I still feel terrible for making him relive that moment. But as I grew up, as campus activities were replaced with bills and my own career, the ghost hunter fell from the forefront of my mind, little by little. Until last week when I moved in with my fiancé. When I took the boxes into the basement despite his warnings of spiders and mold. Because there's a large slotted drain in the center of the room, and I'm so worried, so scared about what I might know. I hope you will enjoy this story. Now let's move on to our second story. We took turns at my sleepover trying to tell the scariest story we could. I think I won. George yawned and fidgeted on the carpet. The light from my bedside lamp caught his blonde hair and made it shine like a halo. He twirled a lock from his fringe around his index finger, let it snap back into place, then started twirling it again. The kid looked bored. He'd obviously agreed to come round mine for a sleepover because I was new at school, and he wanted to see what kind of house I lived in. Get a sense of what I was like. But I could tell he was already regretting the decision. I thought you said you had a PS4? George's eyes flicked around the bedroom, as if he was hoping the console would magically appear from somewhere. We'd been upstairs since dinner. He'd explored my room and we'd chatted for a bit, then watched some random shows on Netflix. Things were going okay at first, but as the last light bled out of the day and the sky outside darkened, I could tell George was losing interest. That was when I suggested we do something a bit different. Nah, I don't have one, I said. Sorry. Are you still up for having a go at this game, though? What, telling each other stories? Isn't that little kid stuff? George glanced at the watch on his wrist. I followed his gaze. George's watch was the first thing I noticed about him. He sat in front of me in English, and I spotted the watch after a ray of sunlight glinted off its face and caught my eye. It's a really nice watch. Most of the kids in my year have digital watches. Those blocky ones that light up when you press a button on the side. But George's watch was different. More adults. It was one of the reasons I'd picked George to invite over. Hey, can I try your watch on? George looked up at me and frowned. What? Your watch. Can I try it on? It's really nice. George stared at me for a second longer. One hand moved to touch the strap on his wrist as if to make sure it was still secure. Sorry, I don't let anyone try my watch on. My dad says I'm not allowed. He glanced around the room once more, his eye going from the door to the dark window. He sighed. Okay, let's play this dumb game then. What do I have to do? Ignoring the bored look on his face, I smiled. It's really easy. We just take turns telling each other a scary story. Like the scariest story you can possibly think of. Then whoever's the scariest wins the game. George rolled his eyes. He stretched his long legs out in front of him. I don't know any scary stories. Besides, I think I might get some sleep soon. I'm pretty tired. Come on, just one each. You must know at least one scary story. Everyone does. Plus, I know loads of good ones. I watched George's face for a reaction. Unless you're one of those kids that frightens easily, that is. Then I guess you might not like the game. It was a risk, but George bit. I'm not scared of anything. The skin below his blonde hair creased into a frown. I've watched horror films with my big brother that are rated 18. We even found one on YouTube that's been banned and I still watched it. I didn't say anything, just looked back at George and smiled. After a few seconds, he let out another sigh. Fine, let's play your stupid game then. But after you're done failing to scare me, that's it. I'm going to bed. George went first. His story wasn't bad, in fairness. It was one he said his uncle told him a couple of years back. Nothing I hadn't heard before. Basically, there are two kids, and one of them gets hit by a car and dies. After the funeral, the mother gives the surviving kid some money to go and get liver from the store. Something to cook up for dinner. Because he's sick in the head, though, the kid pockets the money, digs up his brother, and removes his liver instead. Then later that night, the dead brother rises from his grave to come and get the kid in his sleep. It's a decent enough story, but I'd heard it 100 times already. I didn't let on, though. I made all the right faces and jumped at the right parts. George got quite into it. He gestured his arms and his watch glinted in the light from my bedside lamp. His blonde hair spilled across his forehead. He was so into the story he didn't seem to notice. After it was over, he sat back, brushed the hair from his eyes and grinned. I thought you were going to shit yourself at one point, he said. You might as well give up now anyway. I'm not scared of anything. I looked across the room at him. The house was quiet now and had been for a few hours. When we'd first come upstairs, there was still noise coming from below, the faint sound of the TV in the lounge, the rattle of plates being put away in the kitchen. Now there was only silence. Beyond the bedroom window, tree branches rustled in the wind. The occasional car passed by on the road outside. That was it. I grinned at George. So you're not scared of anything at all? Nope, nothing. Not even stories that are true? George let out a bark of laughter. Nice try. Just hurry up and get it over with, will you? I'm already bored. Okay, fine. I shuffled forwards on the carpet, so I sat closer to George. Our knees were almost touching. George frowned, but he didn't move. My story is about a family, I began. A family that looks normal enough on the outside, but isn't really normal at all. George rolled his eyes again. He was starting to annoy me quite a lot by now, but I didn't let on. I just carried on with the story as if I hadn't noticed. This family moves around a lot. They never stay in one place for too long. They can't, you see. The family's good at disguising themselves. They're good at hiding their secret. But they still can't take risks. If they stayed in one place for any more than a few weeks, they might get found out. Someone might discover what they really are. So, what are they then? I wanted to tell George not to interrupt, to just sit still and listen to the story. But I bit down the urge. Instead, I just grinned at him. The family are monsters, I said. They're all monsters. They travel from town to town, and they leave a trail of dead kids wherever they go. I paused, expecting George to interrupt me again, but he didn't. He only stared back at me. There was no expression on his face as he twirled a lock of blonde hair around his finger. The family has a very specific way of doing things, I continued. When they move into a new area, they find a house that's been left unoccupied. Not a completely empty house, just one where the people that normally live there are off on holiday or something. One that'll be empty for a week or two. The family doesn't need long, see? A couple of weeks suits them just fine. So they break into this house and then they go about setting the trap. It's their own kid they use. They send him off to make friends in the neighborhood. Round the nearby parks, maybe off to the local school under a fake name. Tell him to get to know the other kids. The family is hungry by this point. Really, badly hungry. But they don't do anything just yet. They've learned to be patient. I paused and took a breath. This was a story I'd told before, but I found I liked it more and more with each retelling. The trick was not to rush, though. You had to savor it. I'd opened the bedroom window when we first came upstairs, and now a draft of cold air blew in. It ruffled the curtains behind George. Tree branches shook in the garden outside, the leaves whispering to each other. George watched me, not saying anything. I had his attention. The kid's parents don't have to wait long, I continued. They never do. They've trained the kid well, see? He's not just a victim in all this. He may only be young, but he knows how the game works. Once the family has been in the area for a little while, in a few days, maybe a week at most, the kid makes his choice. He picks a new friend to invite back to their house. The parents give him an incentive, too. He's still too young to share the taste they have. They tell him that's something he'll only acquire when he gets older. But he still gets something out of it. What does he get out of it? George's eyes were fixed on mine. His finger kept twirling the same lock of hair over and over again. He gets the other kid's stuff, I replied. Whoever he picks. He gets to keep all their belongings after his parents are finished with them. Somewhere in the house below us, a door slammed. George's eyes flicked away from mine towards the bedroom door, then back again. I smiled at him. So, George kept his eyes on me as he tried to formulate the question. So, what exactly do the parents... What do they do with the kids they take? Oh, they eat them, I replied. They eat their insides. They tear the kids open while they're still screaming, and they pull out their guts and intestines by the handful. Wolf everything down until there's nothing left but a husk. I grinned. Somewhere below us, a floorboard creaked. The sound was faint and muffled, and I don't think George heard it. Can you imagine what someone looks like when they've had everything inside them removed? They hardly even look like a person at all. It's like the stuff a snake leaves behind when it sheds its skin. The glow from the bedside lamp made George's skin look pale. His lips were slightly parted as he stared at me. But how do they get away with it? He asked. Don't the parents of the kids that get taken come looking for them the next day? When their kids don't show up back home? I grinned back at George. I'd been hoping he'd ask this. Oh, the family's long gone by that point, I said. They vanish like shadows in the night. The only thing they take with them is the remains of the dead kid. And when their parents come looking for them the next day, all they find is a locked house that belongs to somebody else. Another floorboard creaked. It was louder this time, and we both heard it. The sound had come from the corridor outside the bedroom. George's head swiveled in the direction of the door. His eyes were wide in his pale face. What was that? Oh, that was nothing, I lied. Probably just the house settling. There's nothing to be scared of, George. I eyed the watch on his wrist and imagined what it would look like on mine. From the corridor outside came the soft sound of approaching footsteps. Wow, what a story! But that's not all. There are so many more incredible Reddit tales out there. Which one should we explore next? Let me know in the comments. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our future adventures into the world of Reddit. See you in the next video.